Hey, Pastor Steve Waldron here, New Life Pentecostal Church, Albany, Georgia. We're going to uncover some of Charles Darwin's old tweets. Now, of course, we know Twitter wasn't invented then, but if it was, this is the type thing that maybe would be on his Twitter thread because it's actually things he wrote and actually thing he believed. So we're going to uncover, we're just calling it uncovering his old tweets because that's what people do today is they uncover your old tweets and then they, whatever you deplatform you or shame you or whatever. So we're going to uncover some of Charles Darwin's. Did Karl Marx's the other day. All right. And so what was the name of his book? It was On the Origin of the Species, right? By the means of natural selection. But the subtitle was this, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. The preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. As a matter of fact, he called, Darwin classified his own white race as more advanced than those lower organisms, such as pygmies, and he called different people groups savage, low, and degraded. Harvard evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould, who's one of the best writers ever read behind, but I would disagree with almost everything he wrote. But he could write well. He said this, Stephen Jay Gould, Harvard evolutionist, said biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. And that comes from his Ontogeny and Phylogeny, 1977. Read this, and then we're going to read some more of his old tweets. It says, Darwin's error was later exposed to the field of genetics. What Darwin didn't know was that people have the same brown-colored skin pigment called melanin. A person's genetic makeup determines his potential to produce certain level of melanin. That's why we see a range of skin shades in people, from light to middle brown to dark. Our differences literally are only skin deep, because we all come from Adam and Eve, and then after that from Noah and Mrs. Noah. Let's get back to some of his old tweets, as we're humorously calling this. We'll get back to this. Is some quotes that he had. And this is from The Descent of Man. All right, he said this, it has been asserted that the ear of man alone possesses a lobule, but a rudiment of it is found in the gorilla. And as I hear from Professor Pryor, it is not rarely absent in the Negro. The sense of smell is the highest importance of the greater number of mammals. To some, as the ruminants in warning them of danger. To others, as the carnivora in finding their prey. To others again, as the wild boar, for both purposes combined. But the sense of smell is extremely slight service, if any, even to the dark-colored races of men, in whom is much more highly developed than in the white and civilized races. The account given by Humboldt, and we need to do something on Humboldt. What a wonderful thing he was. Who did I hear? I heard a pastor in California give a wonderful thing on Humboldt one time. The power of smell possessed by the natives of South America is well known and has been confirmed by others. M. Huzo asserts that he repeatedly made experiments and proved that Negroes and Indians could recognize persons in the dark by their odor. Dr. W. Ogle has made some curious observations on the connection between the power of smell and the coloring matter of the mucous membrane of the olfactory region as well as the skin of the body. I have therefore spoken in the text of the dark-colored races having a finer sense of smell than the white races. Those who believe in the principle of gradual evolution will not really admit that the sense of smell in its present state was originally acquired by man as he now exists. He inherits the power in an enfeebled and so far rudimentary condition from some early progenitor whom it was highly serviceable and whom it continues to be used. Okay. Here's some more of his old tweets. It appears as if the posterior molar wisdom teeth were tending to become rudimentary in the more civilized races of men. These teeth are rather smaller than the other molars, as it's likewise the case with the corresponding teeth in the chimpanzee and orang, and they have only two separate fangs. In the melanin races, on the other hand, the wisdom teeth are usually furnished with three separate fangs and are generally sound. They also differ from other molars in size, less than in the Caucasian races. It's an interesting fact that ancient races in this and several other cases most frequently present structures which resemble those of the lower animals than do the modern. One chief cause seems to be that of the ancient races stand somewhat nearer of the long line of descent to their remote animal-like progenitors. And so if you're listening close to what I'm saying, I mean, he's basically saying, well, the white people, they're the ultimate of evolution, and people with darker melanin are not. And please forgive me if I've quoted him and used certain terms that, I wouldn't normally use in everyday conversation. I do want to apologize for this. It's often been said, as Mr. McNamara remarks, that man can resist with impunity the greatest diversities of climate and other changes, but this is only true of the civilized races. Man in his wild condition seems to be, in this respect, almost as susceptible as his nearest allies, the anthropoid apes, which have never yet survived long when removed from their native country. So here we go. The above view of the origin and nature of the moral sense, which tells us what we ought to do, and of the conscience, which reproves us if we disobey it, accords well with what we see of the early and undeveloped condition of this faculty in mankind. A North American Indian is well pleased with himself and is honored by others when he scalps a man of another tribe. And a Dayak cuts off the head of an unoffending person and dries it as a trophy. With respect to savages, Mr. Winwood Reed informs me that, and he puts Negroes of West Africa often commit suicide. It is well known how common it was amongst the miserable aborigines of South America after the Spanish conquest. It's been recorded that an Indian thug conscientiously regretted that he had not robbed and strangled as many travelers as did his father before him. In a rude state of civilization, the robbery of strangers and indeed generally considered honorable. So I'm thinking of like Napoleon, I'm thinking of the French Revolution, I'm thinking of Hitler, Goebbels, thinking of Stalin, all these butchers of mankind who happen to have not a lot of melanin, who happen to be what would be called Caucasian. So this just, and people say it was just his time. Yeah, it was just his time. And he had terrible views, and there were Christians that didn't have these views. There were Christians that did have terrible views, but there was a lot of Christians that got slavery, like Gladstone and the Beechers and this type thing here at Beecher. So they got slavery eradicated. So they didn't all have those views. I mean, you're singing old Christmas songs, and the slave is my brother, not a semi-orangutan. He's my brother. And so they knew from Scripture. They were human beings. All right. There's so much. The other so-called self-regarding virtues, which obviously, though they may really affect the welfare of the tribe, have never been esteemed by savages, though now highly appreciated by civilized nations. The greatest intemperance is no reproach with savages. And so, of course, you had Mayans, you had Incans, may have done sacrifice, you may have had certain Indian tribes that did that, but then you had Cherokees that maybe didn't. You maybe had Iroquois that maybe didn't do these things. It's just different people. And we all have a sinful human nature, and Satan influences here too. So, just missing all this. Slavery, although in some ways beneficial during ancient times, is a great crime, yet it was not so regarded until quite recently, even by the most civilized nations. And this was especially the case because the slaves belonged in general to a race different from that of their masters. At some future period, not very distant, measured by centuries. Now this is amazing here. The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, will intervene between man and a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as the baboon, instead of as now between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. I mean, see, we're pulling up Darwin's old tweets, and they're not pretty. They're definitely not politically correct. The partial or complete extinction of many races and subraces of man is historically known. When civilized nations come into contact with barbarians, the struggle is short, except where a deadly climate gives its aid to the native race. The grade of their civilization seems the most important element in the success of competing nations. A few centuries ago, Europe feared the inroads of Eastern barbarians. Now any such fear would be ridiculous. I can't believe all of this. Let's keep reading. There is, however, no doubt that the various races, when carefully compared and measured, differ much from each other, as in the texture of the hair, the relative proportions of all parts of the body. Their mental characteristics are likewise very distinct, chiefly as it would appear in their emotional, but partly in their intellectual faculties. Everyone who's had the opportunity of comparison must have been struck with the contrast between the taciturn, even morose aborigines of South America and the light-hearted, talkative Negroes. There is nearly similar contrast between the Malays and the Papuans, who live under the same physical condition, are separated from each other only by a narrow space of a sea. A certain amount of absorption of mulattoes into Negroes must always be in progress, and this would lead to an apparent diminution of the former. The inferior vitality of mulattoes is spoken of in trustworthy work as a well-known phenomenon, and this, although a different consideration from their lessened fertility, may perhaps be advanced as a proof of the specific distinctness of parent races. You know, I just don't know. Did I just keep reading this? There's more. It's just insane. And as Stephen Jay Gould said, evolution, even the subtitle of Darwin's initial book in 1859, is about the struggle of favored races. And see, so the Bible never mentions the word race. If you're a King James person, it doesn't. It says we're all of one blood. They didn't understand genetics. And so it was just a horrible, horrible thing. And this is why Richard Weikart could say, you know, like Mein Kampf, Hitler went into evolution in Darwin. And this is why Lenin and others, you know, it said when communists took over a country, that the first thing they did, they started teaching evolution in the schools because it let people, there was superior, and robber barons and social Darwinism and all of this. Man, let's just look at this. Let's see, was Darwin a sexist? We've already kind of seen from his old tweets, and I say that, you know, surreptitiously, that he was. Was he a sexist? The chief distinction in the intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the senses and hands. We may also infer from the law of the deviation from averages, so well illustrated by Mr. Galton, that's Francis Galton, in his work on hereditary genius, that if men are capable of a decided preeminence over women in many subjects, the average of mental power in a man must be above that of a woman. The greater intellectual vigor and power of invention in man is probably due to natural selection, combined with the inherited effects of habit. For the most able men will have succeeded best in defending and providing for themselves and for their wives and for their offspring. It's just amazing. So, you know, I'm sitting here as I'm reading all this, I'm thinking of like Ben Carson, who's, you know, neurosurgeon's got like 37 doctorates. I'm thinking of Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, you know, two of the most brilliant people that I have personally ever read behind. Dr. Carson, unbelievable. I had the opportunity to meet him as well. And, you know, the list is just endless. It just is, you know, George Washington Carver. And it's like, this is insane. This is just crazy. And this was only 150 or so years ago. And so this is something fascinating. I mean, you can look this up. This is on BBC. Was Charles Darwin a racist? I'll just show you that article. BBC, but it's in others. I think it's The Guardian. It's just in tons. So, I mean, look. And so people say, well, you can't judge the theory by the person, but when it's convenient, they'll not just judge somebody's thoughts by the person, they'll judge it by punctuation, pronunciation, and even association. So that's not an accurate standard. So, but he was a good writer. He could write well, he just wrote the wrong stuff. So we dug up Darwin's old tweets. He just needs to kind of get out of our lives. So God bless. I'll talk with you later in Jesus' name.